The phone rang just after 2:40 a.m. I remember the sound shrill and hollow in the silence of the front office. Wind was clawing at the windows, and the snow had picked up again, thicker than before. The voice on the other end didn't say hello, just one sentence. He walked past the camera, but he never left the room. Click. That was it. I hung up and just sat there for a few seconds, watching the lobby monitor. Room 3B's door was still shut, same as it had been since the man checked in. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever worked the kind of job where things only go wrong after midnight. And if these stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened back in the winter of 2006. I worked night desk at a place called the Timber Ridge Lodge, a medium-sized mountain resort a few hours outside of Denver. Mostly older couples, hunters, and small retreats. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful. I'd taken the job after my divorce. My son had just left for college, and I was trying to find quiet wherever I could. I remember that winter started early. First snow came late October, and by Thanksgiving, we were getting blizzard warnings every other week. That night, early December, it was just me and Len Turner on duty. He was the overnight maintenance guy. Solid quiet, liked his coffee, black, and his sports radio turned low. We didn't expect anyone new that night. Snow was already coming down heavy by sundown, and most of our guests were tucked in by 9. I was about to lock the front door when the bell rang. A man stood just outside the glass. He wasn't dressed for the weather, no hat, no gloves. Just a dark gray coat and boots that looked more decorative than warm. He carried a small duffel bag, the kind that might hold 2 shirts and a pair of socks. He didn't speak much, just said he needed a room, paid in cash, asked for something quiet. I gave him 3B. It was at the end of the West Hall on the 3rd floor, far from the stairs, away from the ice machine. I remember writing down his name, but when I looked back at the registration slip later, it was blank. No ID, no car. Len said he must have been dropped off, but we hadn't heard another vehicle all night. The man never made eye contact, but he nodded politely, took the key, and disappeared into the elevator. That was around 10:20 p.m. Len and I talked about it briefly. He said he didn't like the look of him, said he walked too softly for someone built that solid. I brushed it off. We'd both seen plenty of weird guests, people passing through, people hiding from something. As long as he paid and didn't cause trouble, I didn't care. I checked the cameras around midnight, nothing strange. Room 3B's door hadn't opened since he entered. No calls, no complaints. A couple on the 2nd floor reported their TV remote wasn't working, so I walked one down from the spare drawer and stopped in the lobby to refill my coffee. That's when the front desk phone rang. I picked it up expecting one of the late guests needing a wake-up call or extra blanket, but the voice, it was male, flat-toned, and spoke like someone reciting a line from a script. He walked past the camera, but he never left the room. That's all he said. Then he hung up. I stared at the receiver for a few seconds, then set it down. I figured maybe it was a prank, but we hadn't had any kids in the lodge all week. I buzzed Len on the radio. "Hey, you see anything weird near 3B? He came back after a pause, said he was down in the laundry basement, hadn't been upstairs in hours. I told him I was going to check the monitors again. He didn't ask why. The third-floor hallway was covered by one camera mounted by the elevator. It faced the length of the corridor, catching every room door, including 3B. I rewound the footage, playing it back from around 10:30 onward. Nothing. At 10:22, the man walked down the hall. His posture was stiff, like someone carrying tension in their shoulders. He moved slowly. No wasted steps. I watched him reach 3B, unlock the door, and step inside. The door shut behind him. That was the last movement recorded. No exit, no door opening, no motion at all in the hall after that. I scrubbed through 3 hours of footage at double speed, watching the snow pile higher outside, through the windows at the far end of the hall. No one entered or left that room. I called Len again. "I think something's wrong up there." He said he'd head up and check. Told me to keep an eye on the feed. I watched as he came into view on the monitor, his maintenance vest bright against the dim hallway lighting. He passed 3A, paused briefly outside 3B, then knocked. I could see the knock, but couldn't hear it from the camera. He knocked again, then leaned closer to the door, listening. After a few seconds, he keyed in the override and opened the door slowly. The angle didn't show the inside, but I saw him hesitate, one foot inside the doorway, the other still in the hall. He said something, probably called out hello, then stepped in fully and disappeared from view. The door didn't shut behind him. It stayed slightly ajar. 2 minutes passed, then 5. I was just reaching for the radio when he stepped back into the frame. His face looked pale, like he'd just walked in from a blizzard without a coat. He pulled the door shut behind him and walked straight back toward the elevator. I met him halfway down the second floor. He didn't speak at first, just gestured for me to follow him to the break room, where he poured himself a full mug of coffee and drank half of it without breathing. Finally, he said, "There's no one in there." I blinked at him. "What do you mean, no one?" "The room's empty. No bag, no coat, no boots, no sign anyone's been in it." We both went back up, together this time. The door was locked when we arrived, still latched from the inside. Len unlocked it again, and we stepped inside. It was normal, untouched, bed still made, bathroom door open, no steam, no towels used. The heat was on low, the window shut, the closet empty. I remember running my hand along the inside of the door. It was cold, but not frozen, like it had been closed for hours. I asked Len if maybe we mixed up the room. He said no. He saw the guy go into 3B, watched it on the feed with me. We pulled the logbook. Sure enough, the only room assigned after 9 p.m. was 3B. Paid in cash. No name, no license plate. I checked the camera again, watched the footage start to end. Nothing had changed. At 2:47 a.m., just before the call, I did notice one thing. For a split second, maybe a second and a half, the hallway camera glitched. Not static, not a skip. The hallway just blanked. The lights flickered on screen. The motion sensor tripped for no reason. But the door to 3B never opened. It's been nearly 20 years, and that room still gives me a weird feeling. We changed the carpeting in 2012, repainted the walls, even got new keys installed across the entire floor. But every so often I still hear from folks who stay in 3B. They'll come down in the morning and ask who was walking the hall in the middle of the night. Say they heard slow footsteps stop just outside their door. A knock, then silence. Always just one knock. Always at 2:47 a.m. I don't usually talk about this, not because I'm ashamed, But because every time I try, I get that same question, the one people ask when they don't believe you. Why didn't you just turn around? And the truth is, I tried. The road just wasn't there anymore. It was mid-August 2021. I was 52, then still doing heavy rig work out of Henderson. Mostly late shifts and desert routes, fixing what breaks in the middle of nowhere. That week, I'd been helping a guy out of Goldfield get his sand hauler prepped for sale. I'd finished the job late that Friday, close to 9:30 p.m., and instead of staying over like I usually would, I decided to head back south to beat the weekend heat. It's a 3-hour drive if you don't stop longer, if you need gas, which I didn't. The tank was full, the engine was smooth, and I had nothing but clear road ahead. The stretch between Goldfield and Beatty is strange country at night. Mountains off in the distance, flat salt beds glowing under the moon, and a kind of quiet you don't notice until you roll down the window and hear nothing, not wind, not bugs, not even your own tires half the time. I wasn't more than 45 minutes out when I spotted the lights behind me. 2 of them. Headlamps, maybe half a mile back, closing fast. At first, I figured it was another late driver in a hurry, maybe someone running I-95 south, trying to make Vegas before midnight. But the lights kept coming and there was something off about how they moved. They didn't rise and fall with the road, didn't drift like headlights usually do over dips and curves. They stayed level, dead even, and then they split. One pair shifted off to the right like it had taken an invisible ramp that shouldn't have existed out there. I remember slowing down a bit, trying to get a better look through the mirrors, but the road behind me was still empty, nothing but black and red behind the taillights. 10 minutes later, I saw a car parked on the side of the road, just off the shoulder, pointed at an angle. A 2-door Civic, or maybe a Saturn, hard to tell, but it had those factory fog lights still glowing, cutting sideways through the dust. As I passed, I saw the driver's door hanging open, and what looked like someone crouched low by the front passenger tire. No hazard lights, no movement. I passed without slowing, but it stuck with me. I'd seen breakdowns out here before, but usually people make themselves visible. Pop the hood, wave a flashlight, something. This one felt staged, like a setup that hadn't fully committed to being a trap yet. About 5 minutes later, I called it in on the hands-free. Highway Patrol has a line for reporting roadside issues, and I figured if someone really was in trouble, they'd want to know. The dispatcher was polite, asked for the mile marker make of the car, and said they'd send a unit to check it out. I thanked her and kept driving. That should have been the end of it. But about 15 minutes later, I passed the same car again. Same color, same fog lights, same angle, same open driver's door. Only this time, there was no one crouched beside it. I pulled over. I knew I hadn't turned around. The road hadn't looped. I'd driven it too many times. I got out and looked around. The air was dead, still warm, but not hot and silent in that way you only get deep in the desert. My phone still had signal, so I checked the map just to be sure. I was exactly where I should have been except for the car. I called the dispatcher again, and this time I could hear the shift in her voice. She said a trooper had already passed the area and hadn't seen any vehicle on the shoulder. I asked her to double-check the mile marker. She did. We were both looking at the same stretch. "I don't know what to tell you, sir," she said. "Maybe it moved." I hung up and got back in the truck. I passed that car one more time. 10 minutes later, just before the road started cutting through a low pass. This time, The door was shut, and all the lights were off. I didn't stop again. The pass was narrow, and the moon was starting to dip low. The temperature dropped fast. I remember turning down the fan and rolling up the window because the air had started to feel damp, like morning fog was coming early. But there was no fog, just the smell of something metallic faint like brake dust, or the way a battery smells when it starts to vent. As I came through the pass, I saw another set of headlights ahead, this time facing toward me. They were parked in the middle of the road, blocking both lanes. I slowed to a crawl. The vehicle was an old Dodge Ram, no plates. The cab was empty. The engine wasn't running. I crept forward, staying centered in the lane as much as I could. Right as I drew parallel with it, I saw movement up ahead, 2 figures walking toward me, from the shoulder maybe 20 yards out. They weren't in a hurry, just walking. I eased the truck to a stop. Neither of them waved, neither said a word. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but one of them was holding something that caught the light, long and narrow. A crowbar or maybe a tire iron. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse wheels, kicking up grit, backing straight down the road the way I'd come. They kept walking. I reversed for at least half a mile until I found a wide enough spot to turn. Then I gunned it, pushed the truck harder than I should have, letting the rear tires slip a bit on the gravel as I swung it around. But when I got the truck straightened out and started heading north again, something was wrong. The road was different. Not just unfamiliar wrong. The grade was steeper, the surface rougher, more like old concrete than the asphalt I'd been driving on for the last hour. There were no lines, no reflectors, and the desert around me didn't look the same. The silhouettes of the hills had shifted. I should have recognized that stretch. I'd driven it dozens of times. But this was like someone had drawn a rough copy of it from memory. I kept going anyway. What else could I do? About 10 minutes in, I spotted taillights ahead. Red glow, maybe half a mile out. I slowed a bit, thinking I was catching up to another driver. But then the lights vanished, not over a hill or around a bend, just gone. I stopped the truck and killed the engine. And for the first time since I started driving that night, I realized I couldn't hear anything. Not the wind, not the cooling of the engine, not even the static hum that usually comes with silence. I waited there for maybe 2 minutes, then tried the engine again. It turned over without hesitation. I kept driving until I saw the sign Goldfield, 6 miles. I'd gone in a full circle, only I hadn't made any turns. When I rolled back into town, I pulled straight into the sheriff's lot and sat there with the engine running. A deputy came out, asked if I was okay. I told him most of it left out the part about the road changing. He listened, took a few notes, then asked me to describe the truck that had blocked the pass. When I did, he nodded like he'd heard it before. Said they'd found a vehicle like that abandoned a few weeks earlier outside Beatty. Reported stolen. No driver ever found. Before I left, he asked what route I'd taken. I told him Highway 95 South. He looked at me real quiet-like, then said something I'll never forget. "That stretch has been closed since yesterday," he said. "Washout near mile 112. Whole section collapsed. Nobody should be down there." I didn't argue. Didn't mention the dispatcher who took my calls. Didn't bring up the car that kept reappearing. I just got back in the truck and drove north instead. Slept in Tonopah. Took a longer way home the next day. Sometimes I wonder if I actually turned around out there, or if I crossed into something I wasn't supposed to. That stretch of highway past Goldfield. I don't take it anymore. Not because I'm afraid of breaking down, but because I'm afraid the road will let me in again, and not let me back out. Back in 2019, I was driving nights for a small cab company based out of Kansas City, one of the last ones still hanging on in the era of rideshare apps. Most nights were slow, and that was fine by me. You pick up the occasional drunk, maybe a factory worker pulling a double, but otherwise, it's just you and the hum of the city after hours. I didn't mind the silence. I liked the way the streets emptied out after midnight, how everything softened a little under the orange glow of those old sodium lights. But there was one night and one passenger that made me think twice about being alone out there. It was a Thursday, just before Thanksgiving. Cold, but not snow on the ground cold yet. The kind of night where your windshield fogs from the inside if you stop too long. I remember it because I'd just finished a run from Union Station out toward Raytown, dropped off a kid going home from school late. Nothing unusual. Around 1:20 a.m., I got pinged for a pickup near an industrial warehouse complex off Front Street, one of those big concrete buildings with chain-link fences and no signs. The kind of place that's either running 24 hours or completely abandoned. Dispatch didn't say much, just gave the address and told me someone had called directly, not through the usual system. I pulled up to the spot. Nothing looked open. No lights, no motion. But there was a guy standing at the edge of the lot, right next to the gate. He stepped forward the moment I stopped, opened the back door without hesitation, and slid in. He looked like he could have been mid-40s, wearing a dark jacket, buttoned up high, and one of those winter caps that pull low over the ears. Neatly shaved, no visible dirt or sweat, but something about him didn't quite fit. Maybe it was the way he sat too still. No adjustment, no glance around the car. Just settled into the seat like he'd already been riding for a while. He told me he needed to go west near the state line, a neighborhood I knew mostly warehouses and shipping yards, quiet at night. I asked for the address and he gave it without pause. Didn't ask about the fare, didn't ask how long it would take. Just stared forward through the windshield. I tried making small talk at first, like I always do. Just a quick late night for you. He didn't answer. I figured he was tired. Happens. Some folks don't want to chat. So I focused on the road. Took the 670 bypass and headed west, letting the heater run just enough to keep the windows clear. About 10 minutes in, I glanced in the mirror. He was still sitting upright, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Not the dashboard, not his phone, just ahead. He hadn't moved once. I remember thinking maybe he's military or just wired tight. But something about him kept putting my nerves on edge. Then I noticed something small, but it hit me hard. His coat. It looked warm, thick, but it wasn't zipped, not even buttoned, and the air in the car was still cold. I had gloves on. He had nothing covering his hands. His breath didn't fog the window. I watched for a full minute. Mine fogged. His didn't. I told myself maybe the angle was wrong. Maybe I just couldn't see it from where I was. But the thought kept spinning in my mind. And then he spoke. "Stop at the next gas station." His voice was low, even. No impatience, just a statement. Like he knew there'd be one, like it was already decided. I said sure, and took the next exit. There was a 24-hour station just off the frontage road, one of those older ones with the big, bright canopy and flickering sign. I pulled in slow, waiting for him to get out, but he didn't. He just stared at the building, then leaned forward slightly still in the back seat and asked me to go inside and get him a cup of black coffee. No sugar, no lid. He handed me a $5 bill. His fingers were cold, not winter cold, like holding dry ice. I remember it vividly. That feeling stayed in my skin for minutes after. I got out, walked inside, and told the guy behind the counter I needed coffee for a passenger. The clerk, maybe early 20s, glanced out the window toward my cab. Who, he asked. I pointed to the car. He looked again. There's no one in your back seat, man. I walked to the window, leaned out past the display rack, and stared. He was right. The back seat was empty. No open door. No movement. Just the faint glow of the interior light. I stood there, not sure what to say. The clerk must have seen something in my face because he asked me if I was okay. I said I didn't know. Bought the coffee anyway. No lid, like he asked. Something told me I had to. When I got back to the car, the door was closed. The back seat was still empty, but the air inside smelled like cigarette smoke. Not fresh, that stale, embedded kind. My cab had never been smoked in. I was strict about that. And on the seat, right where he'd been, was the $5 bill. Dry, crisp, ice cold. I poured the coffee out onto the pavement, drove to the nearest parking lot, and sat there for almost 20 minutes with the engine running and the heat blasting. The car never warmed up. Not really. I kept checking the mirror, waiting for something, a sound, a shape, but nothing came. Eventually, I radioed dispatch and told them I was done for the night. They asked if I wanted to log the trip. I said no. But before I shut the meter off, I looked at the fare. $13, sorry, $13. I hadn't noticed it climb. Didn't remember setting it. But that number stuck with me. The next morning, I had the back seat steam cleaned. Didn't tell the guy why. Just said I'd spilled something. A week later, I was talking to another driver, older guy named Don. I told him the story left out the weird details. Just said I'd picked up a fare off Front Street who disappeared before we got to the drop. He looked at me real careful and said, "Dark jacket, quiet guy, westbound ride." I nodded. Don told me something similar happened to him. Same area, same request for coffee, same empty back seat, different gas station, different week. We both stopped picking up calls in that part of town after midnight. I don't know what I picked up that night, but I still think about that $5 bill. Crisp, cold, clean, like it hadn't been touched in years. And sometimes when I drive past that same gas station, I glance at the pumps. Every once in a while I see a man standing just outside the light, watching the cars that pass. He never moves, never waves, just waits. I flew a lot that year, more than I ever wanted to. 2016 was one long chain of back-to-back meetings, bad hotel breakfasts, and corporate software rollouts that no one asked for. I was based out of Austin, but our biggest contracts were up in Illinois and Michigan, so DFW became my second home. Every other week, I'd drive up before dawn, catch a red-eye out of Terminal A, and try not to lose my mind in the fluorescent limbo of gates and food courts. I could walk that airport half asleep. I knew which security lines moved faster, which vending machines actually gave change, and which chairs didn't squeak if you leaned back. That's why I noticed when something felt off that morning. It was early March, just before daylight savings kicked in. I had a 6:15 a.m. flight to St. Louis, and I'd arrived way too early thanks to a hotel shuttle that ran ahead of schedule. I remember the terminal being unusually quiet, not empty, just quiet. Like the acoustics had changed somehow. The usual mix of announcements and murmuring voices felt damp and distant. I chalked it up to fatigue. I hadn't been sleeping well. I grabbed a cup of coffee from a small kiosk that had just opened, then started my slow walk toward gate A32. On the way, I passed a closed-off corridor I'd never really noticed before. Most travelers wouldn't think twice about it, just another construction barrier, maybe a hallway undergoing maintenance. But there was a temporary sign posted awkwardly to one side. Handwritten, "Detour to Regional Gate Annex." I thought maybe they'd shifted boarding for a few gates, so I followed it. The path took me past some vending machines, then into a side wing with older tile flooring yellowed, scuffed, and badly lit. This area didn't match the rest of Terminal A. The ceiling was lower, lights flickered, and the temperature dropped sharply. Still, there were signs posted every so often: Annex Gates A70, A75. I didn't remember those gates ever existing, but I kept going. The hallway eventually opened into what looked like a small waiting room. Maybe 40 seats, a single desk, and windows looking out toward a dark corner of the tarmac. That's when I saw the plane. It was sitting maybe 50 yards out from the window. A small regional jet, the kind used for short hops across state lines. But it wasn't parked like a functioning aircraft. It looked wrong, slanted, listing slightly to one side. One of the engines had collapsed inward, and the fuselage was charred in places, not fresh fire damage, but old blackened streaks like something had burned and been left to rot in the sun. There were no markings, no tail number, no airline logo. And then I noticed someone inside. Through the warped glass of the plane's forward window just behind the cockpit, I could make out the outline of a man seated by the emergency exit. He wasn't moving, didn't blink, just stared straight ahead as if the plane were still in motion and he was waiting to land. I stepped closer to the glass, tried to make out more, but the morning light hadn't reached this corner yet. Everything outside was cast in blue-gray shadows. Then something strange happened. My phone vibrated a text alert from the airline app. Gate change. My flight was now boarding at A18, back where I'd started. I turned around, half expecting to see a few other people in the annex with me, maybe an airport employee at the desk. But the room was empty. I hadn't noticed how silent it had become. I retraced my steps, but the hallway was longer than I remembered. The vending machines were gone. The tile had changed under my feet. For a brief second, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, but that wasn't possible. I had only gone straight. When I finally stepped back into the main terminal, the sound returned, the dull roar of voices, gate announcements, the screech of suitcase wheels. A TSA agent passed by, and I almost asked her if the annex gates were still in use, but the words caught in my throat. Back at A18, the terminal looked like it always had. Bright, polished, familiar. I boarded my flight, trying to shake the cold still clinging to the sleeves of my jacket. A few days later, back in Austin, I went looking online for old gate maps. I was curious, wanted to know if maybe I'd stumbled into some disused part of the airport. But nothing came up. No mention of annex gates A70, A75. No renovations scheduled that month. I even tried some deep digging travel forums pilot message boards. The only thing I found was a thread from 2009 where someone mentioned a regional wing being shut down after an accident on the runway. I clicked through. A commuter flight had crash-landed in heavy crosswinds. There was no explosion, no fire, but one of the engines caught and dragged, leaving scorched damage along the side. The plane came to rest near a disused access area that had been fenced off years prior. I scanned the article. 3 passengers were injured. One man, seat 8A, was listed as unresponsive when crews arrived. He was never publicly identified. The last line of the report mentioned something odd during cleanup. Some responders reported seeing him still upright in the seat, eyes open. No pulse, no expression, just watching through the window as they approached. That part I couldn't stop thinking about. I've flown out of DFW a dozen times since. Always stick to the main gates now, never stray. But sometimes, especially when it's early and the terminal's half asleep, I'll feel a cold draft by gate A30. And once, in the reflection of the window, I swear I saw that same listing plane, still sitting there, still waiting. I've worked the night shift most of my life, but there's a particular kind of stillness out on Highway 285 that gets into your bones if you stay long enough. Alamosa sits in a wide valley surrounded by mountains that seem to trap the silence at night. By 3 in the morning, the only sounds are the hum of the fluorescent lights inside the station and the occasional gust of wind rattling the thin glass doors. The gas pumps click, the cooler hums, and every so often the clock on the wall reminds you how slowly time can crawl. It was during one of those nights, early March of 2022, when I first noticed him. I'd been behind the counter scrolling through headlines on my phone when the bell above the door chimed. A man stepped inside wearing a blue hoodie pulled low over his head. He didn't say much, just walked to the counter, slid a 20 across the glass, and asked in a low, flat voice for $12 of gas on pump 2. He didn't look at me when I gave him his change, didn't buy anything else, didn't linger, just filled his tank, got back in his car, and pulled away at exactly 3:17 a.m. At first, I didn't think much of it. Night shift regulars get into patterns, and you stop questioning them after a while. But the next night at 3:17 on the dot, the same car rolled up. The same man came inside. Same hoodie, same request. $12, pump 2. He didn't look tired, didn't look rushed. He just carried himself with a kind of mechanical calm that made the hair on my arms stand up. By the 3rd night, I started watching the clock. I told myself it was a coincidence that maybe he just had a routine commute or was working a job that kept him on the road. But when the bell chimed again at 3:17, down to the minute, I felt something shift inside me. His movements were identical, the slide of the bill, the same words in the same tone. It was as if he'd pressed rewind and played the moment again. I decided to test it. The 4th night, when he placed the 20 on the counter, I held it a second longer before giving him his change. He didn't react. His eyes didn't flicker. He just stood there, patient still, like a mannequin waiting to be reset. When I finally handed it over, he turned without a word, filled his gas, and drove away. By then, I was unsettled enough to mention it to the regional dispatcher I chatted with on the overnight CB. I told her about the man in the hoodie and the exact timing. She laughed at first, said I'd probably just noticed a trucker on a strict schedule, but her voice shifted when I told her it was $12. "Nobody buys $12 of gas," she said. "Not unless they're topping off, and not every single night." On the fifth night, I stood outside by the pumps to watch him. His car pulled in at 3:17 sharp headlights cutting across the empty highway. He stepped out, handed me the 20 without a word, and stood while I rang it up. The air was cold enough to frost, but he didn't shiver, didn't pull his hoodie tighter. He just stared past me, eyes fixed on nothing. That night, I noticed his license plate was missing. By the sixth night, I was uneasy enough to call the state patrol. A trooper stopped by around midnight, listened to my story, and agreed to hang around until 3. We parked his cruiser off to the side with the lights dimmed. At 3:17, sure enough, the car rolled up. The man stepped out. Same 20. Same words. The trooper walked up to him, hand resting near his holster, and asked for ID. The man didn't move, didn't reach for his wallet. He just stared at the trooper like he hadn't heard a thing. The air felt heavier somehow, like the whole station was holding its breath. Finally, the trooper repeated himself. That's when the man turned, slid the 20 onto the counter, and said the exact words again. $12. Pump 2. Nothing else. The trooper circled the car, shining his light through the windows. No registration, no plates. The inside looked spotless, not just clean, but stripped bare like it had rolled straight out of a factory with no history at all. When he tried the door handle, the man suddenly turned and said louder, this time, Pump 2. $12. That was enough for the trooper to call it in, but before backup could arrive, the man filled, his tank climbed back in, and drove off into the dark. We tailed him for a few miles, but the highway was empty. His taillights never showed again. It was like the road swallowed him whole. The trooper filed a report, but nothing came of it. No one matching that description had a record in the system, and no car like that was registered in the county. He told me to keep my eyes open to call again if the man came back. And he did. For 3 more nights like clockwork, the car pulled in at 3:17. Same man, same bill, same $12. By then, I couldn't even bring myself to meet his eyes. It felt like if I looked too long, something in me might start repeating too. I just rang him up, handed over the change, and waited for the tail lights to vanish into the distance. On the 9th night, he didn't come. I watched the clock tick past 3:17, and for the first time in a week, I felt my shoulders relax. The bell never chimed. The road stayed empty. But I didn't feel relief, not really. It was something closer to dread, the kind that settles in when you realize you've been left waiting for something you can't name. The following morning, when I closed up my shift, I noticed something strange near the pumps. A faint patch of darker asphalt, perfectly square, as if the ground had been pressed down under heavy weight. Right beside it, tucked under the edge of the concrete, was a crumpled receipt. Not from our register, not from any I'd ever seen. It was yellowed, brittle, like it had been there for decades. The date at the top was March 8th, 1982. The purchase listed $12. I still work the overnight shift on Highway 285. I still hear the wind scrape along the glass. And every night I catch myself staring at the clock around 3. Sometimes I think I hear the soft click of the pump outside, even when no car is there. And every so often when the lights flicker, I imagine I'll see him step inside again, sliding the bill across the counter. asking in that same flat voice for $12 on pump 2. And this time, maybe he won't leave. I've never been good at explaining what happened that night. Every time I try, it comes out sounding like some kind of half-formed campfire story, the kind people nod politely at before changing the subject. But I was there, and I still can't account for any of it. It started in the spring of 2011, when 3 friends and I decided to take a road trip west, the kind you talk about when you're 23 and restless. We loaded Matt's beat-up Saturn with cheap gas, bad snacks, and the kind of optimism that comes from not knowing better. The plan was simple: drive through Oklahoma, head into New Mexico, and eventually land in Arizona, where a buddy of Joel's had a spare couch. Somewhere outside Tulsa after midnight, the GPS glitched. The little blue dot spun in place, and by the time it caught up, we'd taken the wrong exit into a sprawl of warehouses and chain-link lots. The road narrowed, cracked, and soon enough, streetlights gave way to long shadows and silence. Matt joked we'd stumbled into some post-apocalyptic set, but no one laughed. The place didn't feel abandoned, not exactly, more like it was waiting. We should have turned around, but the idea of backtracking never came up. Instead, Joel leaned forward from the back seat, pointing down a side road he swore would reconnect us to the highway. The buildings grew stranger the deeper we went. Some looked half-finished with scaffolding left to rust, while others were sealed tight with steel shutters that rattled faintly in the wind. I remember the first uneasy moment when Chris, who had been quiet until then, asked if we noticed how everyone was breathing. It was such a weird thing to say, but as soon as he mentioned it, I realized he was right. The car felt too quiet except for the sound of 4 of us inhaling and exhaling like we'd just finished a run. Nobody said much after that. Then came the napkin. We pulled up to a lonely intersection where a single lamp post flickered overhead. Sitting in the middle of the cracked asphalt was a diner napkin folded neatly. Matt stopped the car so abruptly, I thought the engine had died. He leaned out, grabbed it, and handed it to me with a nervous laugh. In shaky blue ink, the words were scrawled, "You're almost out west." The 4 of us sat in silence, staring at it. Joel tried to brush it off as some weird joke, but none of us could explain why it looked fresh, crisp, as though it had been placed there minutes before. No dirt, no stains, no sign of weather, just sitting there, waiting for us. The longer we lingered, the stranger things got. Chris started tapping his foot against the floorboard harder and harder until Matt told him to stop. Joel kept fiddling with the rearview mirror, tilting it toward himself, even though he was in the back seat. I felt like my thoughts weren't entirely my own, like someone had rearranged the furniture inside my head. We drove on, following the broken road through stretches of chain-link fence that seemed to curve without end. The GPS had gone blank again, showing only a white screen, no roads, no landmarks. At one point, Joel asked Matt to stop so he could get some air. He stepped out into the dark, walked a few paces ahead, and vanished. I mean, gone one moment visible under the dim glow of the headlights, the next swallowed by the space between 2 shuttered warehouses. We called his name until our throats hurt. Nothing answered. Finally, Matt insisted we had to keep moving, that Joel must have gone ahead somehow, and we'd catch him further down. I wanted to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. Chris just stared out the window, knuckles white against the seat. When we came to another intersection, there was something waiting on the pavement again. Not a napkin this time. A photograph. I climbed out to pick it up, my legs trembling so bad I almost fell. It showed the four of us standing beside the Saturn arms, slung over each other's shoulders like a picture someone would snap at the start of a trip. But Joel was missing from the photo. The space where he should have been was empty, the three of us smiling like that's how it had always been. Matt refused to look at it. He just started driving again, faster this time. Headlights bouncing across the cracked asphalt. Chris muttered something about how we weren't supposed to stop, how we'd been told to keep moving. None of us asked who had told him that. The road stretched longer and longer until I wasn't sure we were still in Oklahoma. I don't even remember dozing off, but when I opened my eyes, the car was parked in an empty lot under a bruised morning sky. The driver's seat was empty. The door hung open. Matt was gone. That left just me and Chris. We sat there for a long time, the silence thick until he leaned over and whispered that he could see something moving in the mirrors. I didn't look. I couldn't. I told him we had to go, that we had to keep driving until the sun rose higher. But by the time I worked up the nerve to turn toward him, his seat was empty too. I drove alone until the gas tank dipped below empty, and somehow, miraculously, the highway appeared again. I don't know how I got back, but I ended up outside Santa Fe, the car wheezing into a truck stop just after noon. The photograph was still on the passenger seat, only now it showed just me. I've told this story a handful of times, but people always look at me like I'm making it up. The photo and the napkin are the only proof I have, and I've kept them hidden for years. The napkin hasn't yellowed, hasn't aged at all. The ink is still sharp, the fold still neat. It just sits there, waiting with those same words staring back at me. You're almost out west. I was 27 when I started working evenings at a small funeral home in Springfield, Ohio. It wasn't exactly the career I had envisioned, but after losing a factory job and watching bills pile up, I took whatever work I could get. People don't talk much about the business of death, but it's quieter than you might think. Most nights were routine. Arranging flowers, setting out guest books, making sure the chapel looked presentable before the families arrived. There was one night, though, that has never left me. It was early March, cold and wet, and a service had just ended for a man in his 70s. His family lingered, whispering in that fragile way people do when they're trying not to disturb the silence that hangs over a casket. Eventually, the guests filed out, leaving the viewing room still and dim. The lamps along the side walls cast soft amber pools of light across the empty chairs. I stayed behind, tidying programs and stacking hymnals, waiting for Mr. Hartley to finish paperwork in his office. That was when I saw him. At first, I thought it was one of the family members who had forgotten something. A man in a dark suit slipped out of the chapel doors and walked slowly down the carpeted hallway. He didn't look at me, didn't speak, just moved with that steady, unhurried pace of someone who knew where they were going. But when I checked the sign-in guest book, his name wasn't there. In fact, no one had signed after the first arrival an hour earlier. I glanced back into the chapel, half expecting to see someone still seated, but the room was empty. The air had that stillness to it, the kind that only comes after the last mourner leaves, when the flowers seem to sag a little and the carpet absorbs every sound. Yet I knew I had just watched someone exit. I followed into the hallway, not really thinking, just curious. The man's footsteps should have echoed against the tile, but all I heard was the faint hum of the furnace. At the end of the corridor was a side door that opened onto the parking lot. I pushed it open, and the night air rushed in damp and cool. The lot was empty. No taillights receding, no doors shutting, no trace of movement. When I told Mr. Hartley about it, he frowned but didn't laugh. He asked me to describe the man, and when I did, he said it matched no one in attendance. "You must be tired," he said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. He told me to lock up and head home. I did, but as I left, I noticed something I hadn't before. The guest book, which I had set neatly on the podium, now sat open a few pages back. In thick, deliberate handwriting, a single name had been written. No first name, just a last Keller. That name didn't belong to the deceased or his family. I checked. I asked around later, gently, carefully. Nobody knew a Keller, but the handwriting was bold, too confident to be a mistake. For weeks after I avoided that wing of the building, unless I had to. The hallway felt colder than the others, as though the draft never left. Sometimes when I stacked the hymnals late at night, I would glance at the side doors, half expecting to see that man walk out again. He never did, at least not when I was there. But the part that unsettles me most isn't that I saw him. It's that he signed his name, left it there, like he wanted someone to notice. And I did. That was the last story I can share tonight. Thinking back across all of these accounts, what strikes me isn't the moments themselves, but the quiet details that linger. A napkin folded neatly in the road. A face at a diner who knew more than he should. A shadow moving in a building where no one belonged. None of them screamed for attention, yet they stay lodged in memory, unchanged by time. Perhaps that is what real fear is, ordinary moments that bend slightly, just enough to remind us that the world isn't as settled as we like to believe. Highways, motels, small towns, even funeral homes, all meant to serve as background to our lives, not places that should unsettle us. And yet those are the places that linger. Not because they were violent or dramatic, but because they left behind a question that never got answered. If you've stayed with me through all these stories, maybe you recognize that feeling too. The unease that surfaces in the quiet, when you remember a glance, a sound, or a name that didn't belong. It isn't always about what was there. Sometimes, it's about what stayed with you after. Thank you for listening all the way through to the end. These stories are best shared late at night when the world is still, and I'm glad you spent these moments with me. If you'd like to hear more, please subscribe. Share this with a friend who enjoys quiet dread, and join me again another evening. Before you go, I'd like to ask, have you ever experienced something small and unexplainable that still lingers in your mind years later?